Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I have a dedicated Stephen King book review for y'all. And the Stephen King book that I will be reviewing today is Carrie. And the reason that I'm reviewing Carrie for the channel, for those of y'all who don't know, every month my patrons on my Patreon channel get to vote for which Stephen King book they'd like me to read and review for the channel every month. And I spun the wheel for the month of June, and my patron Theon won, and they chose Carrie, which I'm very glad for because, as you will see in the review, one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, and I'm very excited to talk about it with y'all today. And of course, if there's any other Stephen King books that y'all want me to read, you can always sign up for my Patreon page. You don't have to, of course, but if you want to, you can go on there and you can automatically put in a vote for whatever Stephen King book you'd like me to read for future months. And I've been having a lot of fun because get to reread a lot of great Stephen King books that I haven't read in a long time. So if you'd like to do so, I will leave the Patreon link down below. But anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into the review. So I'm sure most of y'all are aware of this fact, but if you don't know, Carrie is Stephen King's first published novel. He published it back in 1974. Not the first book he ever wrote. I believe that would be The Long Walk. He wrote that when he was in college in the late 60s, but Carrie was the first one that he managed to get published. And of course, the story that Stephen King tells about this book is that he had a lot of trouble writing it at first because he wasn't really getting the female characters written very well, at least in his opinion, and he kind of threw the first draft or whatever in the trash. And then his wife, Tabitha, was kind of asking him about it. And he was like, I'm having a real hard time with it. And then she literally like dug it out of the trash and she was reading it. And she was like, I think you've got something here. I'll help you out. And I think you really got to, work on this and get it done. And then, probably a year or so later, you got Carrie. And then, the rest is history. And I think, in my opinion, Carrie, not only is it one of Stephen King's best books, in my opinion, one of his best novels, it's honestly one of the best debut novels of all time. I have a really hard time thinking of other debut novels where the author just hits it out of the park just immediately. And for me, he definitely does that with Carrie. And I know for a lot of people, it's not one of their favorites and they wouldn't put it in their top 10. And they think that, he gets better and better as he writes. And I do believe that he, becomes a better writer as he progresses throughout his career. But I also think Carrie is just something special in that it's one of the best debut novels of all time. And please, for anyone watching this, please let me know if you agree with me or disagree with me down in the comments below. And I'm also sure that most of the people watching this are aware of what Carrie is about. But if you're not, Carrie is about a girl named Carrie who's a high schooler. I believe she's 16 years old or 17 years old. And the first scenes in this book are her in the locker room showers at school, and she starts to have her period. And the other girls are basically bullying her, and Carrie is acting like she doesn't really know what's happening because she doesn't, and it's very traumatic for her, and that's basically how the book starts out. And then as you progress through the book, you slowly start to realize that she has telekinetic powers. So you get this young girl, Carrie, who's obviously dealing with a lot of bullying issues, but also she's slowly realizing that she can kind of deal with it in a weird way because of her telekinetic powers. She can move stuff with her mind, so she's able to push a kid off of a bike with her mind who's making fun of her, or she's able to make stuff explode or break, and it's pretty cool. She's honestly one of my favorite Stephen King protagonists, and if you know the story and you know the outcome of the book, which I won't spoil it here, but I'm sure most of y'all probably know what happens in the end. I do say she is one of my favorite protagonists, even though what happens in the end, you might consider her a villain. I, however, would consider Carrie's mother to be the villain, and obviously the bullies towards the end of the book, those are more villains than Carrie White. I think she's more of a victim, and she just kind of deals with it in her own sick and twisted way. But I think that's what makes this novel such a terrific masterpiece, is because the lines are definitely blurred between who's a villain, who's the bad guy, and who is just like just people being people, right? Just people being nasty to each other. And I think Carrie White is definitely a conflicting character in that way, because she's obviously been a victim for most of her life because of her mother, because she's just a religious fanatic who basically doesn't let Carrie do anything, and she's very repressed, and they're both very repressed, and eventually Carrie just kind of snaps. And yeah, I love the character work in this book, and yeah, I'm sorry, this is probably just gonna be a gush review for this book, but I absolutely love this book, and if you couldn't tell, it's definitely a 5-star book for me. I will say, though, it is definitely written a little differently than most King novels. A lot of this is written in epistolary style, meaning that a lot of this is from like news articles and news headlines and like just magazines, and it's like secondary accounts of what's happening rather than like the actual plot. You do get that, but a lot of it is actually like I said, secondary accounts of like eyewitnesses, of like what they saw or what they heard. It's definitely written differently than most King books, where a lot of King books are written just like in a complete narrative style. It's definitely an interesting narrative take for his first novel. So like even on the first page, you get like a newspaper headline or magazine article or something like that. And I really don't mind. I know a lot of people don't like the epistolary style, but something like the Themis Files, which is like my favorite trilogy of all time, all of that is written in epistolary style. So I tend to like that format. So I think that might be a contributing factor to why this is one of my favorite Stephen King books of all time. I've also said in previous videos that a lot of King books you can kind of read on just like surface level, and you don't really have to dig too deep into it. But I think for this book, it's pretty hard to miss like the overall messages of bullying. Bullying takes a huge part in this book, and also just religion and religious fanatics, and like how detrimental that can be to someone. I think it's really hard to miss those, especially with Carrie White's mother just being a religious nut, in my opinion, and just repression of just like not letting someone be themselves and being bogged down by religious rules and religious fanaticism. I think that's a huge plot point and theme in this book. And then, like I said, bullying, because Carrie White is such a victim of bullying her whole life, even at a young age up until high school. And of course, the first scene in this book, you know, she's 16 years old and she gets her period for the first time, and she thinks she's dying. Like, she thinks she's bleeding to death. And then all the girls are just in the locker room just throwing tampons at her. Like, plug it up, Carrie. And so she's just like losing her mind, essentially. And for a lot of King books, this theme of like childhood trauma plays a huge role in a lot of books. I mean, that's like a huge theme in It, for example. You've got all of the kids in the Losers Club who are, you know, being traumatized as preteens and, you know, children, and, you know, they're able to essentially defeat Pennywise because of that, because of their trauma. And I think that underlying theme or plot point or whatever you want to call it is basically introduced in Carrie, in his first novel, where you've got Carrie who is going through such traumatic events, and that kind of like triggers something in her mind where she's able to fully form this telekinetic powers. And by the end of the novel, and again, I won't spoil it, but a lot of shit goes down, and It's crazy. But yeah, I think that's definitely a major theme is bullying, childhood trauma, and just religious fanaticism. And like you've seen on probably a lot of my lists, if you're a fan of my channel, I tend to like shorter King books in general. And, this being his debut novel, it is one of his shortest books. This has, pretty large font and it's less than 300 pages. So it takes no time at all to read this. I think the pacing is very good. Also, the audiobook for Carrie is excellent. I loved it. It's also narrated by Sissy Spacek, who played Carrie in the original 1976 movie. I think she did a very good job narrating the story. And also Carrie, me growing up watching Stephen King movies, that was also one of my favorite Stephen King movies growing up. And like I said, it's got Sissy Spacek. It's got a very young John Travolta. And I'm sure there's other actors that I can't remember off the top of my head, but still one of my favorite Stephen King movies. And obviously one of my favorite Stephen King books. And I honestly do think that Carrie is one of the perfect places to start with Stephen King if you haven't read Stephen King before. Not only because it's his first book and you can kind of if you read them in publication order, you can kind of see how Stephen King grows as a writer, but I also think it's just really good. I don't agree with people starting with Itch or The Stand necessarily, unless they're used to long epic books. Like A Song of Ice and Fire or Stormlight, and they want to jump into an epic's tale. For a lot of people, I think starting with a shorter Stephen King book, it's a bit more on the simpler side. It's a better way to go. So for those couple of reasons, Carrie is definitely one of the best starting places for King, in my humble opinion. Also, I just wanted to mention, if you haven't seen my Disney buys Stephen King skit video, I'll link that down below. But in that video, I kind of joke that Carrie White is, related to Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. But I do think Stephen King did that on purpose, because for me, this sort of reads like a perverse fairy tale, right? It's sort of like a perverse version of Cinderella, where, Cinderella gets bullied by her stepsisters, and, she eventually makes the dress, and then they tear it up, right? Spoilers for Cinderella, by the way, I guess, for 80-year-old movie. And in the end, Cinderella, gets the fairy godmother, and then she goes off and marries the prince, right? But for this one, again, I won't spoil anything, but it doesn't end happily ever after like Cinderella does. Something else happens. And that's why I call it the kind of the perverse fairy tale that Stephen King writes here. Sort of the perverse version of Cinderella, if you will. And I think it's very good because of that. And yeah, I don't think I have too much more to say. I really don't have any complaints with this book. I think it's near perfect. I'm sure I could find a couple nitpicks in here, but for today's purposes, I really love this book. I give it 5 stars. Probably a top 10 Stephen King book for me personally. And I would love to hear your opinion about it in the comments below. What do you guys think of Carrie? Is it one of your favorites? Is it not one of your favorites? Is it kind of meh? Either way, I'd love to hear your opinion down in the comments below. And thank you guys so much for watching my review for Carrie. And that was the Patreon winner for June. And I haven't spun the wheel quite yet for July. I think I'm gonna wait until like the last week or last couple of days in June, and I will spin the wheel and I will figure out which Stephen King book I will be reading in the month of July. And of course, I'll leave a link down below for my Patreon page, just in case you guys want to support me and get a chance to vote for which Stephen King book you'd like me to read and review in the month of July. But anyway, I think that's enough for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, like I said, I'll leave a link down below for my Patreon page. Go check that out and see what it's all about. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching and have a terrific day.